Welcome to our webinar, More Movements, No Problem, our final webinar in our multi-part series about Oracle FCCS. We're looking forward to walking you through how to get data into FCCS and make movement adjustments from there. Today's presenters will give you a deeper look into our topics and throughout the webinar. With that, happy to introduce Andrew Fahey and Will Stewis. Andrew Fahey is one of our senior solution leads here at Platform Specialist. Leveraging his industry expertise and technical acumen, Andrew has led large-scale projects for global organizations across the consolidations, forecasting and planning, data integration, and analytics functions at Platform Specialist. Will Stewis is a CPA with experience at both EY and KPMG, who can dive deep into the nuts and bolts of how companies report financial data. I'm Molly Mackler, and I'm our Director of Client Success here at Platform Specialist. I'm here to be your point of contact for any and all things related to our resources and expertise. And if you'd like to schedule a demo of FCCS or the other technologies that we support for your organization, I'll be your best point of contact. We're glad to have some of our clients joining us today and very excited to welcome the new names and faces to the webinar as well. And I'd like to briefly introduce our firms, all those new folks, and refresh our current clients on our offerings as well. Platform Specialists, in a nutshell, we pride ourselves on being a group of straight shooters who serve our clients first. We partner with the leading EPM technologies in this space, and today we'll be focusing on Oracle FCCS. Our goal is to tailor the best fit of our services, solutions, and technologies for your business needs. And a key differentiator that we bring to the table is that each of our consultants thoroughly understand both the technical and functional components of the business challenges that our clients face. And that really gives our firm the ability to take a holistic approach to serving our clients efficiently and effectively. We've implemented hundreds of solutions within the EPM space, and we're based on the East Coast, although we do serve clients across the US as well as internationally. Platform Specialists has supported clients across virtually all major industries, and we're able to speak your language in order to help solve specific business problems. We'll be focusing on cash flow and FCCS today, but we also help our clients with financial planning, budgeting, consolidation and close, reporting, and business analysis, as well as systems integration. Okay, enough about us. I'll pass it over to Andrew Fahey to get us started.
Thanks for the intro, Molly. So today we have the final installment of our three-part webinar series on cash flow in FCCS. And if you haven't seen the first two, be sure to check those out on our website. Just to recap what we've covered so far in those sessions for any of you that may have missed them. In the first session, we introduced FCCS, which is Oracle's cloud consolidation tool, and it's intended to help you get up and running with its out-of-the-box features and calculations. Then we reviewed how the pre-seeded movements dimension is used to drive the analyzation of account balances going from opening balance to closing balance. We also saw how those movements are then used to build the cash flow statement itself. Then in the second session, we went a step further and dove into the movements dimension, how it works out of the box, and how the balance sheet rolls from period to period. And finally, we explained how FCCS calculates the FX impact on opening and FX on movement for each of the balance sheet accounts right out of the box to help demystify the FX impact. So that brings us to our final session. And over the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to show you to continue the theme of cash flow in FCCS, but this time we're going to be focusing on data, because without the ability to input and adjust data, you have no cash flow statement. We're going to first start out by looking at how you can use the built-in data management tool to load data. And after we get data in, we'll look at a custom approach for adjusting the movements via roll forward schedules. And with that, I will pass it over to Will to get us started.
Thanks, Andrew, and welcome everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so before we begin today, if anyone is having difficulty seeing the screen, just please give us a heads up in the chat. So for the first part of today's webinar, we're going to discuss importing data through data management. To start, we're going to be using a simple SmartView ad hoc as an example. In column A, we have the view dimension, which we will touch on shortly. In column B, we have the movement dimension member. And in column C, we have the account dimension. Now, as we mentioned In the prior webinars, FCCS is periodic in nature. However, FCCS is set up to accept either periodic or year-to-date data. Utilizing the periodic method is simply loading data to the periodic member in the view dimension, which can be seen highlighted here. FCCS then uses this periodic data to calculate the year-to-date balances. This calculation is simply the summation of all periodic movements. On the other hand, if you were to load year-to-date data, a year-to-date input member in the view dimension would be used. That can be seen highlighted here. Year-to-date data would be loaded to this member, and then FCCS would back calculate the periodic values to store data in the system. Now, data is not actually stored in this year-to-date input member after the data is loaded, but is rather used as a holding spot to calculate the periodic value and is subsequently cleared. To illustrate how the loading of year-to-date data works, let's input $100 to the year-to-date input member for January. Once we submit the data, FCCS calculates and stores the periodic value for January, which we can see is the same as the year-to-date value. You will also notice that the year-to-date input member has been cleared. As we mentioned, it is only a holding spot to perform the periodic calculation. Now for February, if we load $1,000 to the year-to-date input member and we submit the data, the system calculates the periodic activity based on the activity that occurred in January. You can see here, the February periodic movement is nothing more than the February year-to-date input of 1,000 minus the January periodic movement of 100, which gives us a February periodic movement of 900. Again, you will notice that the year-to-date input member has been cleared. This same process would occur for all periods, for all income statement accounts, since all net income accounts roll into retained earnings at the end of the year. Conversely, for balance sheet accounts, data is typically extracted from your GL in life-to-date or closing balance format. Out of the box, FCCS does not take into account the previous year's activity. The year-to-date input member is truly year-to-date and not life-to-date. So for balance sheet accounts, very slight customization would be required in FCCS to load year-to-date data. Now that we understand that FCCS is set up to accept either periodic or year-to-date data, let's get into the system and see how data is actually loaded. Is anyone having issues seeing the screen now that we're in the system?
Did have one person mention that.
Let me
They were having
let me stop the share and start again and see if that handles the issue. Is that better for everyone?
Let us know in the Q&A.
Great. It looks like in the Q&A that worked for everybody. So sorry about that. So now back into the system, FCCS comes with a built-in tool called data management that helps users easily get data into the system. Data management can be accessed through the navigation menu, and this enables users to integrate data from an external source system with Oracle's financial consolidation and close cloud. Data from your source system can either be directly integrated in some cases, or data can be imported through text files or CSV files, which is what we will be demonstrating today. From there, you then map the data in your flat files to your FCCS dimension structure and import the data to the application. Now that we're in data management, you'll notice at the top there's a workflow tab and a setup tab. We'll start in the setup tab, and from here, we can create import formats. These import formats define the layout of the source data files and specify how to map columns or fields in your data source or load file to your FCCS data structure. If we scroll down to the mapping section and you look at the far left, you will see the source column and the field number, which represent the name and number of the column in the CSV file. For instance, you can see that source column shows account and field number shows 1. If we were to look at our CSV file that we are loading, this would tell us that column A has the account number in it. We know this is column A because of the 1 in the field number. When creating the mappings, the columns in the CSV file, which are denoted by letters, need to be translated to a number. So A would be 1, B would be 2, and so on. Now, if we look to the far left, you will see the target. This is telling us where the data will be loaded in the FCCS data structure. To round out our example, we can see that column A of our data load file is mapped to the account dimension in our target application. This same concept would be applied to the other FCCS dimensions, as you can see on the screen. Now, we discussed earlier that data can be loaded either periodically or year to date. The default to this is year to date if no view is specified. However, in our example today, we are loading periodic data. So you see that FCCS periodic is listed in the expression section of the view dimension. In the setup tab, we can also create locations to associate with the data integrations. Each location has its own data load mappings, data load rules, and security features, which we will get into shortly. Once all of this is complete, we can switch over to the workflow tab, which is used to execute the actual data integrations. The first step in this process is to define data load mappings for each location. Before we start creating mappings, we want to ensure we are in the right location and the right period. We will look at the bottom of the screen, and if it is incorrect, we have the option to change it. For our example today, we're going to be working in North America for January 2018. Data load mappings map source system member names for each dimension to the corresponding application member names. In a very simple example, if the source GL has account A-1.0001 and it belongs to account 10002, then a mapping will be created that links these two accounts together. This mapping can be seen highlighted in blue on the screen. Once in the data load mapping section, we will have the ability to choose the dimension we would like to map. In our example, we will look at the movement dimension in order to get our cash flow to populate correctly. As we touched on in the prior 2 webinars, the general approach is to map each of the balance sheet accounts and P&L accounts to one movement member as a default. Some of you out there may be lucky enough to have a movement member on your extracted GL, so the mappings will be very simple to set up. However, most GLs are not preceded with the movements, so we will need to create mappings that tie the accounts, or maybe even a sub-account, to the proper movement member. You can see in our example that we are using explicit or one-to-one mappings. This means that each balance sheet account is mapped to one movement member. For example, account 111000 is mapped to FCCS movements cash. FCCS does allow for more complex mappings such as multi-dimension mappings, and we even have the ability to do custom SQL scripting. So not everything needs to be as basic as this. Once the mappings for all dimensions are completed, we are ready to import our data load file. In order to import the file, on the Workflow tab, we navigate to the Data Load Rules section. Before proceeding, again, we want to make sure that we are in the correct location and period. From there, we will go in and we will upload our file, whether it's on our desktop, whether it's on shared drive. Once the file is uploaded, you'll see the file name will appear in the file name box. We'll hit save, and then we will begin to execute the rule. After we hit execute, a pop-up screen will appear. We will select import from source and export to target. We have the ability to export the data to the target application at this time. This is not necessary on the first go, but it is important to note that an export to the target application will then need to be run later. I will go ahead and import and export during this stage. At the bottom of this pop-up, we also want to select replace for both the import mode and the export mode. What this will do is clear out the existing data that has been imported prior. There is also the option to merge the data with previously loaded data if that is needed. After that, we'll click run, and the rule has begun and the data will begin to be loaded. Now, there are a few options here to check the status. We can either refresh right here on the data load screen, or we can click on this little clock here that shows that it's running. This will take us to a data process, a process details screen, and here we're able to refresh and check the status and the stages of all the processes. The green check marks are good. That indicates that the process has been run and that that the data has loaded successfully. So after data is loaded, the data load workbench is where you can see the data that was loaded to the system. There are gold fishes at the top. When these are gold, it means that the import, validation, or export was successful. The bottom portion shows all the data that was loaded to the specific location. You can see in the bottom right corner a count of the number of records that were loaded. This is a great check to be able to tie to the CSV file for completeness of your data load. You can also filter on specific account to see the source account and target account and all the other dimensions for which the account was mapped. The other great feature of data management is the auditability. You can run reports that show any changes that were made to the mappings or data. So here we can see a sample audit report for the North America location that shows us any changes made and who made them, when it was made, and the actual activity that occurred. So it's a great way to see who's making changes in the system and if any of them are necessary or unwanted. Finally, from SmartView, users have the ability to drill back from Excel to data management to see where data is coming from. If we click drill through on SmartView, we open up our Internet Explorer, you'll see that it takes us right back to data management. We can even go further and see the mappings for this data point that went into loading the file. So now we've had the ability and we've loaded data successfully. And with that, I will pass it back to Andrew, who will continue the webinar.
Thanks for that, Will. Okay, so at this point, we've now loaded data to our application and mapped it to the correct movements using data management. But you might have been watching this and thinking to yourself, that's just not going to work. One balance sheet account can't just go to one movement number. I need to analyze my balance sheet roll forwards across several movement categories. Well, don't worry, we've got you covered there. What we were loading through data management is just going to represent what we're calling the default movement, or where the data was first loaded to the application. In the next part of this webinar, we'll go through how you can make adjustments to the movement, often referred to as completing your roll forward schedule, to get the data into the correct movement buckets for your cash flow statement. I'm going to put forward one caveat here. So far in this entire webinar series, we've been showing you things that come 100% out of the box. Well, this is the first area where we're going to go off script a little bit with a custom solution. To enable this, we use a combination of customization of the business rules, metadata, and input forms. What we built is a custom approach that allows you to input adjustments to your movements and then have the system automatically offset those inputs against the default movement where the data was loaded, which keeps the closing balance in line. And don't worry, this is going to make a lot more sense in a minute here. Our approach really focuses on making things easy to maintain and provide the ability to easily audit the flow of data in the system. What we're going to do first is take a look at this in action. Then we'll unwind this a bit to understand how it's enabled. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to put myself in the shoes of a corporate consolidations user during the close. So we're going to go into my data card here, which represents all of the forms, and then go under cash flow. For those of you that saw the first two installments, you know that anything that starts with FCCS is preceded. But I'm going to come down here and open the fixed assets movement form. And this is a custom form that we created to facilitate the roll forwards input. For this example, we just have a form for fixed assets, but in action, you will likely have additional forms based on your company needs, maybe intangibles, long-term liabilities, so on and so forth. Down the rows, you can see all of the fixed asset accounts in the system that have data for the period we're looking at, which is December of 18. And then looking at the columns, the first one is our opening balance, which the system has calculated. And then we have changes in CapEx and changes in depreciation and amortization, which are the two default movements where we've loaded data for this set of accounts. The next three are a set of inputs where you would actually input the reclassifications of movements. And these are going to be disposals, impairments, and transfers. Next column over for this is a check, which is a system check that we built in to capture any system issues, which we'll get into. And then next is our closing balance right here. Let's take a look at in the first column for land. You can see that we had an opening balance of 155,000. And then in the second column, we have a movement of negative 20,000. That gives us a closing balance of 135,000. And the system has calculated that movement on changes in CapEx, but we actually know that 15,000 of that was a disposal, and then 5,000 was a transfer. What I can do is I can just key those in, and I'm going to come up here and I will hit save. And what this is going to do is it's going to launch the business rule, and it's going to automatically populate the prompts for my entity, year, period, scenario, and it's going to pull those off the form, and I'll click launch. And once that runs here in a few seconds, what we can see is that the amounts in disposals and transfers have netted off of the CapEx, the default. So they're now in those buckets, and our closing balance remains the same. So let's try a couple more. Let's say I want to reclassify 10,000 of vehicles into transfers, so 10,000. And then I see that for office furniture, we have a negative amount of about 48,000. And of that, I know that 40,000 was a disposal, and the remainder was an impairment, 7750. So I can go ahead and type those in, and I'll hit save again to process. And it's going to launch a consolidation. And let that process again. And here we go. What do we see? We have an issue here. We now have a value in our check column instead of netting off the default movement. And it's triggered a validation rule that we built onto the form and turned the cell yellow. So let's investigate this a little bit. What I'm going to do is go to Actions and go to my grid validation messages. And I can see what this is telling me here is that the check column must be 0, and then I should contact my administrator to update the default movement matrix. I'm sitting here as a user. I have no idea what this means, so I'm going to reach out to my administrator. All right, so now I'm in the shoes of an administrator. And now that you've seen it in action, let's dive in a bit to see how it works, and let's clear up this issue. To enable you to input adjustments and net off for the default movements, we need a few things. The first are a couple of new members in the data source dimension. So I'm going to come to dimensions, and just as a reminder, this is something that an administrator would see, not an end user. So I'll just open up my dimensions here, and I will go to data source, data source, and I will drill in a bit. So anything in here that you see that doesn't have FCCS underscore, again, is customized. The first thing that I've done is I've created a subtotal here, which sums up my data management data, any journals, and any other inputs that we've made. The next piece is our movement adjustments, where we actually input those adjustments to the roll forward. And then we also have a system adjustment, which is used to hold that system-generated offset. And what this produces in the end is the ability to see where the data was loaded, what the adjustment was, and then the system offset. And then in total, if I look up here at total input and adjusted, you get the adjusted closing balance in the correct movement bucket. Now let's take a look at this over here in Excel, just to give you a little bit better idea of what's going on here. And what you'll see is very similar to the form that we looked at, but we're going to focus in here on rows 11 and 12, 11 being my source and 12 being my movement dimension. For the first column, we have our opening balances for land, vehicles, and office furniture. We can see our default movement and changes in CapEx, denoted by managed data, where data management will load. The next columns over, we can see the adjustments that we input. So here's our 15, 5, 10, and 40. The next one over is our system offset. We've denoted that this is where the offset should happen because CapEx is the default. What you can see for land, the system has booked an offset of 20,000, which is the offset of the adjustments that we input. But for some reason, vehicles and office furniture are not. And then instead, the data is coming into the check column over here to the right. What you can see for changes in CapEx, I'm looking at this at the total input and adjusted level. Now what we can see is changes in CapEx is actually 0 because we've reclassified these. But something is going on with vehicles and office furniture, so let's try and figure out what's going on here. You might be asking now, how does the system understand what the default movement is, and why is it not working for these two? And that brings us over here to our movement matrix, which I have open in a separate tab. And what this is a matrix that will be maintained by me, the administrator. And what it does is it tells the system what the default movement is for each account. In the first column is our account, and the second column is the movement. And anywhere there's a 1 submitted in the intersection of an account and a movement denotes the default movement relationship. Just note that this matrix is actually maintained in a generic point of view, so it's not entity, period, or year specific. So I don't need to populate this every month, only when an assumption changes or you add a new account. So let's take a look at our 3 accounts in question. If I search for land here, I can see that I have a 1 in the intersection of changes in CapEx and land, so we're good there. But if I look at vehicles and office furniture, we have no 1. So that's why it wasn't populating the default movement. So all I'm going to do is come in here and add a 1 and submit that to the system. All right, good to go. So I will come back to FCCS and get our fixed asset form opened up again. Asset movements. And what I'm going to do really quickly is I'm just going to delete that 10,000 and put it back in and launch my consolidation again. So I'm going to hit save. And the reason I needed to delete it and type it back is just that the system is trying to intelligently understand if anything has changed and trigger that need to run a consolidation. So let's see that run. Okay, just a few moments. All right, voila. Our validation is cleared up. And now we can see the data is correctly netting off of those correct defaults for vehicles and office furniture. So what you can see with this is that even if a mapping input is missed, you always get the same and correct closing balance because of the check member. And I know that I showed you the movements matrix in Excel just to make it easier, but if I come back here to my forms, I actually also have a form that represents the default movement matrix. And this is where you can actually view the mapping of the default movements and even update them if needed. And even further, you might want to have a read-only version of this to the form where an end user could easily come in here and see what the default movement is for each and every account. And it really helps to bring forward exactly what's happening in the system rather than having it behind the scenes in coding or metadata that an end user can't see. And I know we're getting close here. We're actually a little bit over on time. We don't have the time to go deep into the technical coding of how this is accomplished, but I can just show you that if I go to the navigation pane and go to consolidation, what we're going to see on this screen is all of the steps that the system is taking in the consolidations process. And the first one here is it's going to roll forward the opening balance in local currency. The next is calculations after opening balance carry forward. And this is a place where we have the ability to go in and write custom rules. And it's at this point in the process that this netting off logic occurs. There's another place that we can write custom rules after the balance sheet is balanced. And then if I go to translated, I can see that there's also system processes and custom rules in the section where translation occurs. And one more tab for consolidations. I can see items for things like eliminations, non-standard ownership, so on and so forth. So at this point, we've now loaded our data in. We have the ability to adjust our movements, and we're all ready to start generating our cash flow statement. And at this point, this wraps up our 3-part webinar series on cash flow and FCCS. But do stay tuned for more content in the coming months on this and other EPM tools. We really appreciate everyone taking out some time from their busy schedules to tune in. And I really want to thank my colleagues, Will and Molly, for helping to make these webinars possible and successful. And if you want to know more about cash flow or FCCS in general, definitely reach out to us for a private demo. And I'll pass it over to Molly for closing. Okay.
Andrew, can you just bring up that last slide? Thanks so much. Thank you everyone for attending our webinar, as Andrew said, and we will have a recording of the webinar ready for you shortly. And that'll be available on both our website and LinkedIn. And you'll be receiving a note from me to schedule your own demo of FCCS with us and give you an opportunity to ask any further questions that you have following the webinar. And we really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much and have a great holiday season.